When the NHL Draft Lottery was complete, I went through and made my top 21 pick predictions, but today I want to do something a little bit different, going through the top 21 picks of this year's NHL Draft and seeing who I would pick if I was in charge of every single team. Because the difference between what I would do if I was a GM and what I think is going to happen is quite a bit different, and there's a few players that definitely would rise and fall if it were to all be up to me. So who would I personally pick if I was in charge of every single team here? Well, make sure you watch till the end as we go through all the prospect talk here today, and make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're new for all the draft content as we lead up to the draft this summer. Now let's start out with first overall in the New York Islanders pick, and this of course is one that we talked about a ton, really between Michael Misa, Matthew Schaefer, and James Hagens. That's what it seems like the Islanders will be going for. I think for most people, especially when we consider the Islanders and their lackluster defense for the future, they will end up picking Matthew Schaefer, but for me personally, Michael Misa will end up being my pick if it were up to me. Even though Matthew Schaefer, James Hagens, those two guys I think are pretty close to being up to Michael Misa's level, there's a distance enough where I think most teams, for me personally, I would go for Misa in the end, regardless of what you need positionally. Really, I think the only team out there that had the chance for first overall that I think would have and should have gone for Matthew Schaefer was the San Jose Sharks, a team that already has a center similar to Misa in Macklin Celebrini. Even though Misa will be awesome there and very likely could end up there, I think Matthew Schaefer is more of a need for them if they were to get that first overall pick. But for me personally, Michael Misa is my number one for so many different reasons. I think for the Islanders, even though I think they maybe need a player like Matthew Schaefer more, I think Michael Misa will just be the best player of this draft class, and for me, the Islanders aren't in a position where they can really be all too picky. The speed, the skill, the maturity in his game, and how he's able to process everything in conjunction is just so translatable, and you have on top of that the actual production this year, which is just otherworldly. 134 points, 62 goals in 65 games. To me, the Islanders, I don't think it would be a massive mistake if they were to take a player like Matthew Schaefer instead, but Michael Misa to me would be my pick for most teams at number one. Which leads on to the San Jose Sharks and who I would pick if I were in charge of them, and because of Michael Misa going number one, to me it's pretty obviously going to be Matthew Schaefer in the end. It would be amazing to see Schaefer go to the Sharks because honestly, I think that is the perfect fit for what the Sharks team needs going forward. I love Luca Cagnoni and I love Sam Dickinson, two players who I think could be very solid top four defensemen, but Matthew Schaefer I think brings a top pair definitive element that they don't quite have. I'm still a big fan of Sam Dickinson for sure, but I think Dickinson as a number two to Schaefer's number one would really lift that Sharks franchise, especially with how good the forwards and especially the goaltending in Yaroslav Askarov is already looking. Out of all the top prospects in this class, Matthew Schaefer fits the Sharks the best, and if he is available, it is a slam dunk pick to make and easily the selection for San Jose. But this is now where we really deter from my previous mock draft predictions and get into the realm that isn't quite as realistic, but I think for me personally is the direction I would go in. And next up is where we have third overall in the Chicago Blackhawks. And I do think in this position, realistically, Chicago's more in a spot where they want to take a player like an Anton Friendel, for example. But if I was in charge of Chicago, personally, I would be going for Porter Martone. Now, I do rank James Hagens ahead of Martone in my personal rankings, but Martone is exactly I think what the Blackhawks do need, and I'm a little bit more hopeful in the Blackhawks center core going forward than I think some people are, and maybe even Chicago. You got Frank Nazar there, you got Oliver Moore, two guys who I think will be solid middle six centermen, especially Nazar, who looks brilliant in the second half for Chicago. I think getting a true power wing for Connor Bedard is a massive upside bet, and especially at third overall, I think it's a solid pick in all honesty. Even though he has his ups and downs and the consistency I think is a pretty massive problem, I think in Martone's case, when he is at his best, he can be a lethal player, especially on the rush with the playmaking he provides, as well as, of course, the intensity that he has in his game at points. I want to see more grit. I want to see even more of this flashy type of player that we see in spurts. But I think for Chicago especially, having a player like Martone, especially up the right side, I think brings an element that they don't quite have. The size and the grit that he could be bringing is something that Chicago desperately needs, and Martone, it's the perfect package there. Again, I do think for Chicago, realistically, they might go for a more traditional centerman, like an Anton Friendel, maybe even Caleb Denoye or a Jake O'Brien, but to me, Martone is, again, exactly what Chicago needs, and especially up that right wing side, I think having that extra little bit of juice, especially up on the rush, could do them some good. Especially Martone and Bedard together, I think could be real interesting, and that pair, I would love to see. Well, not against my favorite team in the Dallas Stars, but any other team, I would like to see them together. Now, we keep going with the picks that I think will go a lot differently if it were up to me compared to how it would actually go. So let's go on to 4th overall and the Utah Hockey Club. And I talked about it in my mock draft video, and we even talked about it in the video where we reacted to Craig Button's mock draft about James Hagens potentially going to Utah, but how I didn't really see it as a fit for Utah specifically, and how the Mammoth, I think, are trying to build this very physical core coming up, and I don't think James Hagens quite fits that. Well, if it were up to me and actually being in charge of Utah, I don't really care about having this absolute height requirement in the end. I would go for James Hagens personally and have a top 2 center core of Logan Cooley and Hagens, which I think would be pretty sick. Again, I do think Utah is going to want to go, especially if they are going to go for a centerman, somebody that's more of an overall presence, maybe brings more of a defensive game. Again, a player like Caleb Denoye, I think, comes to mind, as well as an Anton Frindell as well, who's more of the physical side of things. But again, if it were up to me, I don't really care as much, especially for Utah that already has such a big defense coming up, such a big wealth of big-time forwards on the wings. I think having a couple of smaller centermen like Cooley and Hagens is fine, especially with how much bulk they've going to be surrounding him with in the next couple decades. I am still a big fan of Hagens, and even though he isn't quite the #1 guy for me anymore, he's still up there in that tier, and is something that I think will be a great, especially second-line center behind Logan Cooley. I think Utah would be a good spot for him to go to, with Cooley already being established as this top centerman for the future. Hagens can really develop in his own ways, and especially as a second-line center. I mean, those two guys, the creativity, the deking ability, the vision, there's going to be a lot to love there, and if you get him some good goal scorers around him, I think those two, as their top 2 centers coming up, would be deadly. On top of the players you already have, like the Barrett Haydens of the world, the McBains, the Cole Baudouins, for example, that will bring some more grit, especially Baudouin, who I think is going to be really fun as a bottom 6 centerman. Having Hagens, having Cooley as your top 2 Cs, I think would be a lot of fun. I don't quite see it being the choice for Utah, but for me, I'd love to see it. Next up, we went to 5th overall in the Nashville Predators, and this one was really hard to come up with because for Nashville, I think they could use pretty much everything across the board, and this is also exactly where my rankings really start to get extremely close. After the 4th place spot, really it's a tier between 5 and maybe like 16. It's extremely close in this range, but ultimately for Nashville, if I was in charge of them, I think I would go for Jake O'Brien, who's been one of the biggest risers for me personally over the second half, and somebody that I think would be a really fascinating project to take on, even at the top 5, which I think is still a bit of a reach, but I think for Nashville especially, they could really use somebody that has the talent level of O'Brien in the end. Even though I think maybe an Anton Frindell or a Caleb Denoye might make a little bit more realistic sense in terms of who I would go for, I think O'Brien will be really interesting in that Nashville pool. One of the younger centers in this draft class, 6'2", 170 pounds, has a good frame on him, but I think the money is going to be made from the playmaking, the vision, the creativity, and also the speed he has as a big centerman. He is something that can absolutely fly out there and actually do some pretty good things as a forechecker. But you see in 66 games this year, 32 goals, 98 points, and a point per game as well in the OHL playoffs. He's something that I just have increasingly loved more and more throughout this season. And I think for Nashville, if you're going to take any of those centers outside of that top end range at number 5, O'Brien might be the one that I like the most at that spot. Now let's move on to number 6 and the Philadelphia Flyers, and this is a range that I think is going to need some explaining here because I think this player is most likely going to drop outside the top 10, but for me personally, I don't think that should be the case. If it were up to me, I would have the Philadelphia Flyers selecting Victor Eklund. Now let me explain this situation because I think for the Flyers, again, realistically, most times out of 10, it's going to be them selecting a centerman like an Anton Frindell or a Caleb Denoye. I understand that. But for one, I think Eklund is a better player than both of those guys, at least up to this point. And also, considering next year's draft, there's quite a few really interesting centers, and personally, I don't think Philly, if I was building them, are going to be in playoff position whatsoever next year. I want to be building up that core as much as possible, and getting a top centerman in next year's draft that a player like Eklund could be the perfect complementary piece with. And you consider just how much of a beast he's been in the Allsvenskan this year, 31 points in 42 games, his incredibly translatable play style. This is somebody that I want to capture as early as possible, and at 6th overall, I think it would be a great pick. I do understand for Philly that in terms of positional need, the wing is maybe the spot where they need the least going forward, but again, I'm typically best player available in my selections, and even though that wavers, of course, in this ranking today, I think in Eklund's case, he's something that would really transform that Philly group and would be a fantastic flyer, would bring so much energy and intensity that I think they would love, on top of bringing a great skill set that I honestly think gets severely underrated. Now, this will be another one that will surprise a few people because I don't think there's much chance that he goes inside the top 20 in this year's NHL draft class. But if we're up to me, especially when we look at 7th overall and the Boston Bruins, who I would personally select for them would end up being Colin Potter. Now, not a lot of people would have Colin Potter, and rightfully so, inside the top 15, at least when it comes to the mock draft, because I don't think there's much of a likelihood that he does. But I think he is one of the most underrated at the top end of this draft class easily, and to me is easily a top 10 player in this draft class for me. Especially when I look at the Boston Bruins and what they need going forward. They don't need another bruiser. They've drafted so many of those guys over the years. They need somebody that can push pace with his skill, with his speed especially, and that's what Colin Potter does so excellently. You also saw the U18s, the energy along the boards, how good he was at winning puck battles, and the intensity he brought with the puck. He's something that I think opened up a lot of eyes still, and even though I don't think he'll go as high as this, I think he should. And I think especially for a Bruins team that needs some skill up the middle, Colin Potter does bring that. I don't really understand why Elite Prospects still has him as a left wing because he's been playing center all year for Arizona State this season. But you can see in 35 games, the points aren't exceptional for him. Just 13 goals, 22 points in 35 games. But he's somebody that I think was just getting snake bitten all throughout, creating so many chances, but it took a little while for him to really get his feet under him. I think he's somebody, though, that just brings so much potential, and especially when you look at that Bruins prospect pool, nobody, I think, brings the excitement that Colin Potter does. And I think I would love to add him to a pool that already has some center prospects like Letourneau and Fraser Minton. Potter, though, in terms of the pace, is somebody that just brings so much different that the Bruins don't quite have. Yes, Potter is undersized, but I would much rather have somebody that's undersized and can actually play the level that Potter does than a Dean Letourneau who is oversized and can't really do much in his freshman season. The difference in both of these players is night and day, and I'd go Potter every single day of the week. Now at 8th overall and the Seattle Kraken, I was debating Radomir Mrka at this Bruins spot for number 7, but of course, with Radomir Mrka available, I have to go for him yet again. Radomir Mrka is one of my favorite defensemen of this draft class, and to me, the second best defenseman of this class behind Matthew Schaefer. We talked about him and mocked him so consistently to Seattle. You guys know my thoughts on him. Extremely mobile, extremely sound defensive game, physical attributes that I think are still growing, and I think his application with those traits is still growing as well. He's something that I think is just such a great stopper for the future, such a great physical presence, and it's something that I think is going to be a solid overall middle pairing defenseman. I think for Seattle especially, they lack a little bit of size, a little bit of physicality on that defense, and I think he's the pick I would make, especially at that spot. Now, going on to number 9 of the Buffalo Sabres. Now, first, if I was in charge of them, I would be doing a lot of different things than what their current management is doing. And I personally would trade this pick to try to get an established, definitive right defenseman now, especially if Radomir Mrka is to not be available. But I do think if the Sabres do keep this pick and I had to make a selection, I would go for Logan Hensler. Now, Blake Fiddler has been the one that I've mocked to this pick because I think he's just a little bit more of a definitive physical presence than Logan Hensler is. But I think in terms of potential as a two-way D, they need a right shot, and I think a pretty solid one. Hensler, I think, brings a lot of good attributes with his skating, and when his confidence is high, the great puck handling ability, he's something that can especially find players all over the offensive zone with his passing. I do think there's a lot of growth there in his defensive game over the course of the season, and I do think he's something that has big-time physical potential, but just hasn't been able to find it consistently in the NCAA. But I think will eventually, and the Sabres, fingers crossed, can develop him right. I think could be a solid middle pair right shot D along the same lines as Radomir Mrka. But again, the potential is out there for the Sabres to unlock. Number 10 and the Anaheim Ducks. In this position for me, I would be in a spot to pick Anton Friendel pretty consistently if I'm Anaheim. Now, for me, it's kind of because of the versatility that I would go for Friendel if I was Anaheim. I mean, they're in a position where they have so many great young pieces, so many great young prospects. They don't really need too much, but I do think getting another definitive center that can play in that middle six is a pretty strong thing, and especially having a top 3 center core of Leo Carlson, Anton Friendel, and of course Mason McTavish on top of that, I think it could be really enticing. The thing about Friendel, though, he can play wing, so he can play on that left side, which I think brings him a different element, especially if the Ducks are going to trade a player like Trevor Zegras in the future for some reason. Friendel can maybe touch onto that top 6, but the physicality, the way he plays, his hard-nosed style, and especially the shot. Anaheim, I think, has a few really complete playmakers, but Friendel brings a dynamic dynamic shot to his game, and I think especially on the power play, the Ducks will get a lot from that in the future, and I think he'd fit pretty well there, honestly, especially behind Leo Carlsson, two absolute SHL and Swedish studs. Those two could be really fun together as well if they were to find themselves in the same power play. And at number 11, we go on to the Pittsburgh Penguins, and this is where I'm going to finally have Caleb Denoye. Now, for me, Denoye isn't quite as high as some other people. There's a lot of hype going into that side of the top 8, potentially even the top 5 for some, and I could absolutely see why. I think the skill set, especially on the rush, is there. The playmaking is evident for all to see. I'm a little bit more questionable about the defensive game. I think he's got this reputation as a two-way player. I don't quite see that as much, especially with the physical game that I think isn't quite as refined as I'd want it to be, but the potential is there, and we can all see it as a middle 6 center for the future. You can see in the QMJHL, the regular season was great, but also the QMJHL playoffs. He's been brilliant, especially as it's gone on. In 15 games, he has 9 goals, 19 assists for 28 points. He's been an absolute beast there, especially for the Penguins. I think they could use this high upside, very creative vision center, and Denoye is absolutely that. And I look at that Penguins prospect pool, they just need pure upside. Denoye, I think, especially at that 11th spot, would be a solid pick all around. Now, we're going to keep going with the centers here at number 12 in the New York Rangers, and I think most likely, if he is available, it'll be a Roger McQueen at this spot, but as you guys will see, I'm not as big of a fan of Roger McQueen as I think the NHL will eventually be. At this spot, though, I look at what the Rangers need, and the intensity and the speed that I think they really need more of in their forward group, and you guys could probably already know who I'm going to pick at this spot. We're going to go for Braden Coots of the Seattle Thunderbirds. We talked about Jake O'Brien, something that has been a big riser for me. Braden Coots maybe been the biggest one as I've watched more of him over the course of this season. He is just such a bulldog out there, a relentless player that has so much great speed and intensity and is so smart with and without the puck. He's a mature leader out there, which I think especially the Rangers will appreciate. But I look at that Rangers center group and I look at what they have and players like Trocheck and Zibanejad. They're just not fast enough. They're not as quick as a player like Coots is with the intensity that he provides. I think he's exactly the type of center the Rangers need a lot more of. Plus, I think he has some pretty underrated skill to boot. I don't think he's going to be a dynamic scorer. I don't think he's going to be something that puts maybe more than 60 points up on the board, but it's something I think will be a 40, 50 point centerman, but the intensity, and especially what he's able to do in the playoffs when he does get there, I think will really propel the Rangers. If they are to select him at the spot, I would absolutely adore that. I don't see it as realistic, but I think at 12th overall, he'd be a pretty great New York Ranger when it's all said and done. Now moving on to 13th overall in the Detroit Red Wings, and most of the mocks that I've seen and what I've done as well out there, most likely it looks like Victor Eklund is going to drop to this spot, and I think he'd be a fantastic Detroit Red Wing. Unfortunately, because I think I like him a lot more than NHL teams, well, I have Eklund, of course, in the top 10, which leaves him out of this spot, but a player I think could be a very interesting Red Wing, especially when it comes to the skills that he's able to provide, is Benjamin Kindle, and he's something that I don't think will be as high as this on draft day, but I do think has a shot in maybe the later half of the teens of this draft class. And I think for the Red Wings, even though he's more of a skill-based player, one of the biggest surprises for me all throughout the season was just how refined he was physically, how many one-on-one battles he would win for his size, and how determined of a player he was in the offensive zone. I think for the Red Wings, of course, they've drafted players who can do that, but don't quite have the skill set to match up with it. But in Kindle's case, he absolutely does. The vision, especially the passing ability, how he's able to make these plays up in thin air almost. He's someone that just brings a dynamic element that I don't think the Red Wings have a ton, at least in their prospect pool as of now, with the guys that haven't yet graduated. Kindle, I think, absolutely is up there, though, and especially as a right wing behind Lucas Raymond, that having a player like Michael Branzik-Newgard as a third-line right wing, that interests me quite a bit for the future. Now on to the 14th overall pick in the Columbus Blue Jackets, and this is a position that we've gone back and forth on as well. I've mocked Braden Coots to them before. I've heard also, of course, players like Jackson Smith as well. I do think if I was the Blue Jackets, I would go for defenseman at this spot, but would it be Kashawn Aitchison? Now, I do think when it comes to draft day, he will go a little bit higher than this, but if he is available to the Columbus Blue Jackets, I think he'd be perfect in that organization. We've seen how they've tried to go for more physical, bigger defensemen over the years, and Aitchison, of course, is that, but the moxie and just how much he puts himself out there as this character on the ice, he is just so much fun to watch. You have, of course, the top 2 left D coming up, and already on the team, of course, in Zach Werenski and now Denton Matejchuk, but I think a player like Aitchison would be a great element to have on the third pair. I think he'd be extraordinary there with the goal scoring, the big bombastic hits. He's just somebody that loves to make all these electrifying plays, and especially on a team like Columbus that has a lot of electrifying players, Aitchison I think would fit right at home there. Now moving on to 15th overall in the Vancouver Canucks, we talked about this spot quite a bit, and I think most likely they'll end up going for a centerman, which honestly, considering their prospect pool, is a position I think they should be targeting. In the end, if I was them, the center that I would personally go for is in fact Cole Reshny. Now, I think this would be a fascinating selection for Vancouver because honestly, it's a high upside swing, and it's not something they would typically do, especially for a forward that's on the shorter end like Reshny. But he is somebody that I think would be a high upside swing in a ton of different ways. The creativity that he puts out there, especially when it comes to the playmaking in the offensive zone, on the power play especially, he is dynamic. 66 assists in 62 games this year, 92 points for Victoria, was an absolute beast in the World Juniors as well, the WHL playoffs. The big slight against him is maybe the skating speed isn't quite as intense as you'd want it to be, and he's not this overly physical player, at least when it comes to his play style. But man, is he so smart. Man, does he have vision for days. And I think especially with the intensity that he provides when he is at his best, I think there is somewhat of a balanced player here in the NHL level. The potential there, I think, is there to potentially be a second line center, though, if it all comes together. The offense, I think, is just so tantalizing that if I'm Vancouver, I think that's exactly what I want in my prospect pool, especially at the center position. Now we move on to 16th overall in the Montreal Canadiens, and this is a player that I don't have quite as high as 16th overall, but the story is just too good not to pick him at this point. I gotta go with Justin Carbonneau. He will be in every single mock draft, every single position ranked at that 16th spot for Montreal. And you know what? If I'm the Habs, I just do it because one, it's a great story, but also he's a pretty good player too. In 62 games this year in the QMJHL, 46 goals, 89 points. I think he is the exact type of player the Habs could use a little bit more in that prospect pool. A premier goal scorer that can play just so definitively on the rush, especially on the power play as well, using that shot and using that weapon to his advantage. He's something that, again, is shades of Patrick Laine, but I think with a little bit more of a dynamic element to him, and a little bit more of a physical presence. He's something that I think I want to see more of that physical game. I want to see more of that frame being used in his game all around, but he's something that I just love the potential of the offense, the potential of the goal scoring. I think for the Habs especially, adding a premier goal scorer, especially that you can add to that middle six in the future, I think is a priority for this draft class, and Carbonneau checks all of those boxes. Then we go on to 17th overall in the Habs, and this is a position that I would normally go with Logan Hensler, but with him being a little bit higher in my personal rankings, I think at this spot I would go for Blake Fiddler. Now, really, we're just switching Hensler and Fiddler when it comes to my previous mock draft in terms of the realistic picks, but I think Blake Fiddler would be a solid Montreal Canadian, exactly what they could use on that third pair, especially on that right side. Big time defenseman, 6'4", 209 pounds, solid skater for his size. I don't quite see a lot of offense potential there, and there are some times where I want to see him be a little bit more engaged with his stick, a little bit more engaged defensively, but he's someone that brings a lot of potential in those departments, and the physical game is refined already for his age. He's something I think will be a solid Hab, though, with some good potential. Not great, but I think will be an NHLer eventually, and especially in the defensive game with the size there. Montreal, I think, could use some more of it on the team in general, and Fiddler does bring that as well, on top of Carbonneau also being a pretty solid body. Now at 18th overall in the Calgary Flames, this is a position where I ultimately see a player like Roger McQueen being a very interesting pick. I do think he will go higher than this position, but if I'm a team like Calgary, I am swinging for the fences, especially with how solid their last couple of draft classes have been. If a player like Roger McQueen is healthy, then the dangling ability he has, the individual skill set, is something I think Calgary could really prioritize and could really use in that top six. We'll see if he actually is able to reach that, but I think he could be really interesting if he's given the patience, which I think Calgary would be able to afford to him. But of course, in Brandon this year, not the most brilliant production in the world, 20 points in 17 games, extremely raw. I don't think really uses his teammates as much as I'd want to, and some of the defensive issues there are pretty evident, so is really a lot to work on here in McQueen's game. But I think especially for the Flames and their prospect pool, how much they've already built it up, taking a high swing like McQueen is honestly, especially in the 18th range, I think a pretty solid bet to make. Now at 19th overall, this is a player that I think is sliding just because of better fits on some of these teams, but I do think is a solid player and especially a top 20 pick. Going on to 19th overall, the St. Louis Blues, if I were in charge of them, I would go for Lyndon Lakovich. Now, he's something that I do think will fall a little bit just because of the lack of real physical or defensive engagement, especially for his size. I think that might scare some teams off, but at 6'4", 190 pounds, I think he's something that just brings undeniable skill. You especially see this year the goal scoring and how much he just wanted to put his team on his shoulders this year. For Moose Jaw, 27 goals, 58 points in 47 games. I think he's somebody that is exceptional on the rush, exceptional in one-on-one situations. Using his teammates a little bit more, being a little more smart with the puck is something I want to see more out of him. But I think the long-term growth here, there's a lot of potential in Lakovic, and I think St. Louis especially could come to appreciate. Now at number 20, we go into the Columbus Blue Jackets yet again. First, they go after Kashan Aitchison, and you know what? Let's just prioritize that physical play at this point. At number 20, personally, I would go for Brady Martin. Now, again, if this was an actual mock draft and we're going realistic picks here, Brady Martin, I think, is pretty likely to be a top 10 pick when it's all said and done at this point. The trajectory with his play in the second half of the OHL season, just how much of a beast he was for Canada at the U18s, how much of a physical presence he was there. I don't think there's really much of a chance that he ends up slipping in this year's draft, especially to the 20th overall pick. I'm a little bit less of a believer in Martin, though I do think he'll be a solid all-around NHL player. I have a little bit less belief in him and his skill set and how much it's able to translate, how much of that is able to really win against a competition in the NHL level. But I do think there's, again, a great physical base here, somebody that is just always in the fight, making the right decisions. And I think it's just going to be a solid all-around third-line center. There's been some comparisons to Sam Bennett. I don't quite see as much offense there, but in Martin's case, I think he's going to be a great one. And especially for Columbus, you had Kashan Aitchison, Brady Martin on the same team together. Those two would do so much damage in the playoffs, it's not even funny. But last but not least, let's go on to 21st overall and the Ottawa Senators. And I could go all over the place here. The Senators are in need of a lot of different positions here, really besides maybe right defense in Carter Yakimchuk already being a part of that prospect pool. A player I would like to see go around this range, maybe a little bit higher, but I think might slip because of the injury, is Carter Bear. Now again, if it were up to me being a GM, taking a player like Carter Bear who had a major ACL injury in his draft year is a hard order, especially for first round picks. You want to make sure you have as much security as possible. Bear in his future is kind of up in the air, but I think he's somebody that still projects very well. We've heard good things about the injury at least, so it seems like he'll be okay eventually. If he is, this is another dog in this class. Like Braden Coots, he is so good along the board, so good in a forechecking role, but also so good around the net and using his skill and using his body. Even though he's not the biggest player in the world, he uses every single inch to his disposal. And especially this season, in 56 games for Everett, 40 goals, 82 points. He's just such a monster out there, and somebody that wants to make that big play, wants to make that big goal, especially for the Ottawa Senators in that middle six, maybe as a second line left wing behind Brady Tkachuk. I think Bear is going to be another big playoff performer, and some of the Sens as well. In that fan base, I think Bear is going to be a fan favorite. But those were my NHL draft picks. If it were up to me in the end, at least for the top 21, I might do an updated one of this as we get closer to the draft and we know all the picks inside the first 7 rounds. But as of right now, that's who I would draft with the first 21 picks in this year's draft. And hopefully you guys did enjoy. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell for more draft content just like this. Comment down below all your thoughts on my top 21 picks. And if it were up to you regarding disregarding all of the predictions and mock drafts and team needs and everything, who do you think? Who do you want, and who would you pick for your favorite team with all the prospects available? Let me know your thoughts down below. Of course, make sure you share it with all the hockey fans you guys know all online, and also click on this card for all my 2025 draft content in one playlist. If you guys haven't noticed, very under the weather. That's why I've been talking so badly today, but hopefully you guys still enjoyed, and hopefully I'll get a little bit better for the next few. I'll see you guys on the next one, though, and have a fantastic hockey day. Goodbye.